What would you think if I told you that silence, not words, not arguments, not tears, is the most devastating weapon a woman can wield? Not in cruelty, not in manipulation, but in the quiet and unshakable certainty of her own withdrawal. Beneath her silence, there is an entire universe collapsing, and a man, standing before it, will feel something he cannot name, something that terrifies him far more than anger ever could. When a woman goes silent, she steps into the ancient archetype of the unknowable. She becomes the high priestess, the shadowed oracle, the sacred enigma that no man can penetrate unless invited. Her silence is not absence. It is not emptiness. It is presence in its purest, most concentrated form, and it confronts him like a mirror polished so sharply he cannot bear to see himself in it. For a man who has grown addicted to pursuit, to conquest, to the sound of her explanations and her efforts to mend, the moment she withdraws into herself, into that sacred cave where his hands and his voice can no longer reach, that is the moment he comes face to face with his own ghost. He begins to feel the tremble of his own unresolved shadows echoing inside the cavern she leaves behind. You see, a man often mistakes his sense of power for control over her responses. He becomes accustomed to her emotional labor, her readiness to discuss, to argue, to comfort, to seek understanding. Even in conflict, her voice assures him of his importance in her psychic world. But when the sound vanishes, when she offers him the cold velvet of silence, the illusion shatters. What does he really feel then? Carl Jung would say he is not merely reacting to her silence. He is collapsing into the void of his own projections. She is no longer the woman. She becomes the vessel of his anima, the feminine within his unconscious that he has neglected, rejected, or misunderstood. Her silence stirs this forgotten anima, and suddenly, he feels not the absence of her words, but the absence of his own wholeness. The silence she holds is not hers. It is his, reflected back at him. He feels abandoned, but more than that, he feels stripped. The scaffolding of his ego begins to sway. The man who once found comfort in knowing where he stood with her now drifts through fog without compass or anchor. He tries to summon the usual tools, logic, pride, distraction, but they fall dead in his hands. Her silence renders them impotent. Some men will lash out. Others will retreat. But those who dare to linger in the discomfort, those who are forced to sit within the echo of her absence, begin to notice a fracture deep inside themselves. This is not about her anymore. It never was. The silence becomes the threshold. It is here, in this psychological abyss, that a man meets his own neglected wounds. The boy who was dismissed, the son who was never heard, the lover who was left behind. These ghosts rise to greet him, summoned by the chasm she has opened. She did not create these wounds. She simply stopped covering them. For the first time, he is left to face the raw architecture of his own emotional house, stripped bare of her scaffolding. And what he feels is not anger at her silence. It is terror of his own. The Stoics wrote of amor fati, the love of one's fate, the embrace of what is. But few men know how to embrace the silence of a woman they once thought belonged to their orbit. Few men know how to sit in the unbearable space between the collapse of ego and the birth of self-awareness. Fewer still survive that encounter unchanged. You listening now may wonder, does he miss her? Of course. But more precisely, he misses the man he was when her voice still wove him into her narrative. Her silence forces him to question that man. Was he worthy? Was he ever truly seen? Or was he merely performing in the theater of her attention? When she goes silent, the play ends. The audience disperses. The stage is empty. And he is left, not with applause, not with rage, but with a haunting stillness that presses against his ribs like cold iron. Silence, in its most brutal form, is not punishment. It is revelation. In the thick silence she leaves behind, time does not pass as it once did. It thickens, it congeals around him like honey gone cold. The minutes no longer belong to him. They belong to the question of her. Every tick of the clock becomes a chisel against his carefully constructed walls. The fortress he built, stone by stone, now echoes with hollow winds. The woman who goes silent is not retreating. She is not vanishing. She is returning to herself. In that return, she becomes untouchable, not in distance, but in essence. She is no longer the woman who explained herself. who handed him keys to doors he never cared to open. She withdraws her energy, her sacred currency, and this is what unsettles him more than her words ever could. For years, he may have danced with the idea of control, the quiet dominance of her emotions, the subtle pull of her need to be heard, to be understood. He may have mistaken her explanations for submission, her vulnerability for dependence. But when she goes silent, when she chooses to withhold her fire, he realizes, too late, that her flames had always warmed him. And now he stands in the cold. You might think men crave freedom in these moments. But it is not freedom they feel. It is free fall. When she speaks, he knows his position. He can predict the terrain. He can hold the map in his trembling hands. But in silence, the map burns. He is a traveler now with no compass, no destination, no confirmation of his worth. Carl Jung would remind us that the psyche abhors a vacuum. And into this vacuum, the shadows rush in. The forgotten selves, the fractured boy, the rejected anima. They fill the silence she leaves like rising smoke, suffocating the illusion of control he once gripped so tightly. In truth, many men are terrified of the silence because it threatens to reveal the scaffolding of their masculinity was erected not to house strength, but to cage fear. They perform, they conquer, they build, but it is often to escape that still, quiet place within themselves where their unloved parts still wait, bruised and breathless. When she was there, explaining, arguing, tending, she unknowingly kept those shadows at bay. Her words were not just for him. They were a dam, holding back the inevitable flood of his unprocessed self. When she ceases, when she folds her words into silence, the dam breaks. A man in this silence begins to notice the ache in his chest, the tremble in his breath, the way his hands feel suddenly useless without the gravity of her energy. He begins to trace the outlines of a loss he does not yet understand. It is not just the absence of her voice. It is the absence of his role in her story. Does he love her? Perhaps. But more urgently, he is desperate to reclaim the version of himself that only existed in the mirror of her attention. Without her gaze, he begins to dissolve. And here, the brutal truth emerges. Not all men can survive her silence. Some will run headlong into distraction, new lovers, endless work, temporary pleasures. Others will attempt to provoke her back into sound, baiting her with cruelty or indifference, because they would rather be hated than ignored. To be erased from her psychic world is, for some men, a death they are not equipped to endure. But the rare man, the man who chooses to stay within the silent crucible, may begin the painful work of self-confrontation. He may come to see that her silence is not a weapon, but a mirror. It does not punish him, it reveals him. You, who listen now, must understand. Her silence is not the closing of a door. It is the opening of a gate within himself, a gate that perhaps he has locked for years. She does not wait beyond it, beckoning. She walks away. The path she leaves is not for him to follow her. It is for him to follow himself. The Jungian path of individuation does not comfort the ego. It dismantles it. It is the slow, brutal alchemy of transforming the boy who seeks validation into the man who seeks wholeness. And it often begins in silence. For in her silence, she chooses herself. And in that choice, she inadvertently offers him the most painful and the most sacred invitation a man can receive, the invitation to meet himself. The man who lingers in the echo of her silence begins to encounter the raw texture of his own soul. It is jagged, unfinished, much like a sculpture abandoned mid-creation. Without her voice to smooth the edges, without her presence to buffer the friction, he begins to touch what he has long feared, the unbearable weight of his own incompleteness. He may try to fill the void she leaves with noise, with the clamor of the external world, the thrum of indulgences, the rustle of hurried companionships. But no sound is loud enough to drown out the silence she imprints upon him. It is not simply the absence of her, it is the absence of the self he projected through her. In Jungian terms, she has shattered the anima projection. She has stepped out of the role he unconsciously crafted for her, the muse, the nurturer, the emotional caretaker. And now, stripped of the feminine archetype he placed upon her, he must confront the truth. She was never his to define. When a woman goes silent, she stops feeding his illusion, and the man is left starving. Some will call her cruel. Some will label her distant, unfeeling. But the deeper truth is that her silence is not a blade. It is a boundary. It is the sacred pause where she reclaims herself from the roles she has outgrown. It is where she refuses to be the emotional shelter for a man unwilling to build his own house. And yet, the silence calls him back. Back to the chambers of his childhood, to the unspoken fears of abandonment, to the longing for maternal approval that was never fully received. A woman's silence can awaken in him the unresolved ache of the boy who was told to be strong, to be silent himself, to bear his wounds without flinching. Now, confronted with her absence, he begins to crumble in the places where he had pretended to stand tall. Does he realize it yet? That it was not her words he missed, but the mirror they provided. Without her, the image fades, and he must ask himself, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when the performance ends? The silence draws out his secret truths, that he has long outsourced his emotional center to her, that he has woven his significance into the fabric of her attention, and that without her tending, the threads of his identity begin to unravel. But this unraveling, though brutal, is sacred. Seneca once wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." The silence she gives him is adversity. It is not the punishment he perceives it to be. It is the trial that invites him toward his own initiation. In that trial, a man must confront his emotional illiteracy, the hollowness of his pride, the false thrones upon which he has seated his worth. Her silence forces him to see the scaffolding he has mistaken for substance. If he dares to stay within it, if he resists the urge to chase the next voice, the next validation, he may begin to hear something softer beneath the collapse, the faint pulse of his own authentic self, buried beneath years of noise. Her silence, then, becomes a sanctuary, not for his comfort, but for his rebirth. But make no mistake, few men walk this path willingly. Most will flee into the arms of another, into the warmth of superficial pursuits, into the echo chambers of those who will speak to them but never challenge them. Yet the man who accepts the weight of her silence, the man who allows it to carve through him like fire through dry wood, he is the one who may emerge from the ashes whole. And as he walks this path, he may come to understand that it was never truly about her. It was about what she reflected. It was about the parts of himself he long refused to claim. You, who are listening, you may feel the pull of this silence. You may recognize it in your own story. And perhaps, you may be the one who has offered it. Know this. A woman's silence is not the end of a dialogue. It is the beginning of a reckoning. For in her silence, she holds a mirror not to his triumphs, but to his fractures. And it is within those fractures that his true self may yet be born. The silence lingers like an unfinished sentence, pressing itself into the marrow of his bones. It is not loud, but it is heavy. He walks through his days wrapped in its invisible cloak, tasting the echo of her absence in the most mundane moments. In the turning of a key, the soft ring of his phone that now never bears her name, the quiet that follows his own voice. The man begins to realize something devastating. He does not miss her noise. He misses what her noise protected him from. Her presence had always been a distraction from the deeper chambers of himself. She spoke, and he listened, or pretended to. She argued, and he resisted, or pretended to. But beneath every word, every glance, every plea, she was shielding him from an encounter with his own hollowness. When she goes silent, the shield falls. And in that unbearable stillness, the illusion of power collapses. Carl Jung taught that the greatest terror of the human soul is to face itself without disguise. The woman who chooses silence strips away his disguises. She no longer plays the role of his emotional caretaker, nor does she perform the dance of explaining herself for his comfort. Her silence is a refusal to carry what was never hers. The man's soul trembles beneath this weight. It searches for noise to smother the rising panic, to subdue the thrum of self-awareness that grows louder each day. But nothing satisfies. Nothing numbs. Do you see? This is not the simple ache of missing someone. This is the psychic disintegration of a man realizing that his sense of self was scaffolded upon the attention of another. Without her, the architecture trembles, the ceilings crack, the foundations reveal their fault lines. There is a reason some men rage against her silence. There is a reason they return, not with humility, but with accusations. The silence she holds is a blade that cuts through his ego, and his survival instinct demands he fight back, demand sound, demand the comfort of her voice, even in anger. For even anger from her keeps him alive in the center of her world. But when she holds her silence firmly, without spite, without performance, she enacts the purest detachment. And this detachment terrifies him more than abandonment ever could. Because abandonment still centers him as the victim, but detachment erases him from the narrative entirely. He is forced to confront his own insignificance in her psychic life. He is no longer the sun around which her emotional planets revolve. He becomes, in the most shattering sense, a passerby in the kingdom she now governs alone. You may wonder, does this silence break him? Sometimes yes. But silence is also the sacred womb of rebirth. If the man has courage, true courage, he may sit long enough within this void to begin the slow, excruciating work of rebuilding not for her, but for himself. The Stoic philosophers warned against the tyranny of external validation. Marcus Aurelius whispered to himself in the cold corridors of the Roman Empire, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinions than our own." The man in silence must now confront this paradox. Without her gaze, her words, her reflection, whose opinion matters now? Where will he turn to find his worth? The silence becomes the crucible where false selves burn away. And yet, this is no gentle fire. It sears. It characters. It peels the skin from the ego with slow deliberation. The man may grieve, but what he grieves is not just her. It is the collapse of the self he was allowed to be in her presence. That self is gone now. He is not returning to what was. He is being invited, violently, painfully, into what could be. And she has already crossed the threshold. She has chosen herself. She has stepped beyond the entanglements that once kept her circling his orbit. In her silence, she has remembered her own gravity. If he follows, it cannot be to reclaim her. It can only be to reclaim himself. But most men will not follow. Most will turn away, will find the next woman who will speak, who will plead, who will keep the stage alive. And the cycle will repeat, until, perhaps, another silence, another mirror, another invitation to stand naked before his own fractured soul. You, who listen, must know this. Silence is not a weapon of war. It is the language of sovereignty. It is the woman saying, without sound, "I will not explain my worth to you." And for the man, it is the question that lingers in the hollow of his chest. Who am I, now that she is no longer here to answer? The man walks through this desert of silence, searching for echoes, but none return to him. He reaches for memories as if they might warm his trembling hands, but memories are no longer enough. They are shadows now, flickering remnants of a world where her voice tethered him to significance. In her silence, he is no longer a hero in her story. He is not the villain either. He is something far more unbearable. He is irrelevant. The psyche recoils from irrelevance. It would rather be loved or hated, remembered in passion or in fury. But to be nothing in her eyes? To dissolve from her psychic landscape as mist dissolves in the morning sun? This is a death the ego cannot comprehend. So he may test the silence. He may throw words like stones into her distance, hoping to hear the splash, the ripple, the sound of her returning. But her silence remains a stone garden, undisturbed, sovereign, untouched. This is where many men falter. They mistake her silence for absence, as if she has vanished, as if she is nowhere. But the brutal truth is she is deeply present, just no longer present for him. Her silence is not void. It is fullness. It is the reclamation of the space where she once poured herself into the shape of his needs. It is the quiet sanctuary where she remembers she was never meant to be a container for his unresolved selves. And what does he feel? Beneath the anger, the confusion, the desperate grasping? He feels exposed. He feels small. Carl Jung would tell us that the projections have shattered. The anima he cast upon her, the idealized, the healer, the emotional provider, has been withdrawn. And what stands before him now is no longer his constructed version of her. She is real. She is whole. She is independent of his gaze. The silence teaches him, mercilessly, that she was never the property of his desires. And you, perhaps you have been this man. Perhaps you have known the suffocating weight of being silenced not by words withheld in punishment, but by the irreversible decision of a woman who will no longer dance for your approval. Do you feel the terror of that? The disorientation? That the scaffolding of your worth no longer stands? That you are now required to build your foundation from within, without the architecture of her attention? Or perhaps you are the woman, the one who once explained, who once handed pieces of herself with trembling hands, hoping to be understood. And perhaps now you sit quietly, not in cruelty, but in profound understanding that the words you once offered were never truly heard. Your silence is not vengeance. It is rebirth. And yet, the man who stays in this silence, the rare one who does not rush to fill it, who does not reach for the next performance, who does not seek another mirror to save him, he begins to hear something beneath the noise of his fear. He begins to hear himself. It is faint at first, the way distant thunder murmurs before the storm breaks. A low pulse, an ancient rhythm. The voice of the self he abandoned long ago in the pursuit of external significance. It calls to him not in the language of the ego, but in the whisper of truth. He may come to understand that it was not her silence that broke him. It was the silence within himself that he had always avoided. The Stoics would remind him, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. But revoking this pain requires standing in the furnace of her silence long enough to allow the ego to burn away. Not all men will survive this fire. Some will collapse into bitterness, weaving narratives where she is the villain who abandoned him, the cold one who refused to speak. Others will wrap themselves in new distractions, chasing noise to avoid the crushing weight of introspection. But some, the ones willing to let the silence carve them open, will walk the path of individuation. They will begin to see that the woman who left them in silence was not an enemy, but a gatekeeper. Her silence was the threshold. It was the doorway through which he could finally meet the man he had buried beneath years of noise, performance, and projection. And she has long since crossed into her own sovereignty. She walks untethered, not because she does not feel, but because she now knows she does not owe her voice to anyone who refuses to listen. Her silence is no longer about him. It is about the sacred space she now holds for herself. In the deep stillness of her silence, something ancient stirs. It is the call of the woman who has remembered herself, who no longer bends the arc of her spirit to fit the shape of another's expectation. She is no longer entangled in the subtle manipulations that kept her explaining, justifying, or softening the truth of her being. The man, if he has dared to remain in this silence, begins to feel the unbearable intimacy of his own raw edges. There are no more distractions here. There is no echo from her to validate his steps. He must now stand unarmored in the hollow halls of his own soul. Carl Jung would say this is the sacred confrontation, the dissolving of projections, the collapse of false identifications. Where he once saw in her the caretaker of his unspoken wounds, he now sees only his own reflection. Her silence has stripped the mask from his anima fantasy, forcing him to meet the neglected feminine within himself. What does this mean? It means he is no longer allowed to cast the burden of his emotional labor upon her. It means he must begin to mother his own brokenness, to sit with the exiled parts of himself that he once asked her to heal. The silence demands this of him. It does not offer comfort. It demands accountability. And it is here, in this sacred discomfort, that a man may begin his true initiation. No longer the boy who seeks her soothing, no longer the man who demands her sound. He may now become the one who listens to the voice within. He may learn to sit beside his own sorrow without begging another to carry it. He may grow into the man who understands that silence is not absence, it is depth. But let us not romanticize this path. It is brutal. It is cold. It is lonely. And yet, it is precisely this loneliness that begins to forge the unshakable core of a man who no longer depends upon the attention of the world to know who he is. You, who listen, may feel the weight of this. You may see yourself in him, or perhaps in her. Know this. When a woman falls into silence, she is not retreating into weakness. She is rising into sovereignty. She is stepping beyond the reach of those who have not earned the right to hear her. Her silence is not the closing of her heart. It is the fortification of it. She no longer speaks to be understood. She no longer explains to be chosen. She no longer performs to be kept. The man who lingers in the threshold of her silence must now choose. Will he build his worth from within, or will he collapse in the hunger for her sound? Some men will rage against her detachment, desperate to pull her back into the dance of explanation. Others will walk away, seething with the bitterness of feeling excluded from the stage he once dominated. But the rarest of men will bow before the silence, not in defeat, but in recognition. He will understand that this silence is not the weapon he once feared. It is the mirror he always avoided. And slowly, painfully, he will begin to weave a new self from the ashes of the one that burned away. Not the self that depends upon the eyes of a woman to feel real. Not the self that needs to dominate her emotions to feel powerful. But the self that can stand alone, that can face his own emptiness without trembling. This is the path Jung called individuation. The relentless process of becoming whole, of integrating the shadow, of calling home the fragmented selves that were abandoned in the pursuit of external validation. And when the man arrives here, truly arrives, he may find himself in the presence of her silence once again. But this time, he does not fear it. He honors it. He honors her. For now he understands. Her silence was never meant to punish him. It was the necessary distance. She chose to preserve her own sanctity, to protect the sacred ground upon which she now stands. She no longer waits for him to understand. She no longer hopes he will return. She has chosen herself, fully. And the man, if he is worthy now, will not chase her. He will not beg her to fill the space with sound. He will stand in the silence with her. Not to possess, not to conquer, but simply to be. For now, he knows. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase. She chooses.